Sara wiped her hands on her jeans as she pulled into the gravel driveway, the faint crunch of the tires against the stones breaking the eerie silence of the isolated countryside. The house stood before her, tall, shadowed, and weary, like it had been waiting for someone to return after far too long. It wasn't the quaint, cozy escape she had imagined when she saw the listing on Craigslist, but it was cheap, and she was desperate. The breakup had left her emotionally raw, and the thought of staying in her old apartment, where everything reminded her of him, was unbearable. The landlord, Mr. Delaney, was already there, standing on the front porch. His figure was stiff and his smile was crooked, as if his face wasn't used to showing kindness. He handed her the keys without much ceremony, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her uncomfortable. "I'll be in touch if you need anything," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "Just make sure you keep things tidy. This house has a history." Sara frowned but nodded, eager to get him off the property. His words lingered in the air, though, hanging like the musty smell that seeped from the house's old wooden frame. Once he was gone, she turned to face the house again. It wasn't terrible, but the wear and tear of time was obvious. The paint was peeling in places, the windows were smudged with grime, and the front door seemed to stick a little as she pushed it open. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something else she couldn't quite place. Something damp. She made her way through the house, flicking on the lights and taking it all in. The living room was quaint, furnished with a mix of antique furniture and faded rugs. The kitchen, though dated, was functional, but it was the bathroom that caught her attention. A room that felt out of place, almost too cold compared to the rest of the house. The bathroom was small, cramped even, with white tiles that had yellowed over time and a rusted clawfoot tub in the corner. The mirror above the sink was old, its surface slightly warped, distorting her reflection just enough to unsettle her. As she stared into it, the temperature seemed to drop. Goosebumps prickled her arms and a chill ran down her spine. The window in the bathroom was fogged, though there was no reason for it to be. Sara swore she could hear the faintest sound of water dripping. She checked the faucet. It was dry, not a single drop falling. She glanced behind her, feeling as if someone was watching her from the doorway, but the hall beyond was empty. "You're just tired. It's an old house. It's going to make weird noises," she reassured herself, though the unease settled deep in her gut. That night, the house's strange energy pressed down on her. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the walls, and the floorboards groaned under unseen pressure. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unnatural stillness around her. Every creak, every sigh of the old house felt deliberate, like it was trying to tell her something. But it was the bathroom that unnerved her the most. Even though she'd closed the door before going to bed, she could swear she heard something from inside, a soft, distant drip, drip, drip. At first, she thought it was her imagination, her mind playing tricks on her in this unfamiliar place. But when she got up to check, the bathroom door was open, just a crack. The faint light from the hallway stretched inside, casting strange shadows that seemed to flicker just out of sight. The dripping sound was gone, replaced by an unsettling quiet that was worse than the noise itself. She stood at the threshold of the bathroom, peering into the darkness, the cold seeping through the tiles like a presence all its own. Something wasn't right here. Quickly she shut the door and went back to bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin like a child hiding from the monsters in the dark. But deep down she knew that Whatever haunted the corners of her new home, whatever lingered in that bathroom, wasn't going to let her rest. The next few days passed in a blur as Sara tried to settle in. She convinced herself that the unsettling feelings were just nerves, that she was simply adjusting to a new environment. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, the bathroom's strange energy was impossible to shake. Every time she walked past it, she could feel the air around it grow colder. It wasn't just her imagination. Something was wrong with that room. The small things started to pile up. The bathroom door would be open when she swore she had closed it. The window, always fogged, even though she couldn't figure out why. And the mirror. It distorted her reflection in subtle ways, almost as if it was warping her image, making her look tired and gaunt, more so than she actually was. She chalked it up to stress, to the exhaustion that had been weighing her down for months now. The breakup, the move, it was all taking its toll. But still, that feeling persisted, the sense that she wasn't alone in the house, that something unseen was watching her from the shadows, especially when she was in that bathroom. It wasn't until her third night that things took a darker turn. She woke in the middle of the night to the sound of dripping water again. The noise was louder this time, more insistent, like a leaky faucet left running. Groggy and irritated, she stumbled out of bed, heading toward the bathroom. But when she opened the door, the sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. The bathtub, empty just hours before, was now filled with water. The surface was dark, murky, and motionless, as though something lay beneath. The dripping sound had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Slowly, she backed out of the bathroom, her heart pounding. She closed the door, her hands trembling, and hurried back to bed, pulling the covers over her head like a frightened child. But no matter how hard she tried, sleep wouldn't come. For the first time since moving in, Sara was truly afraid. She could feel it now. Whatever had been lurking in the edges of her awareness was no longer content to watch from the shadows. It was coming for her. That night, as she lay awake, listening to the house groan around her, she knew something had changed. The house wasn't just old, it was alive, and it was hungry, and it had chosen her. The nightmares began subtly at first, just after Sara had settled into her new routine. They were disjointed images, flashing in and out of her mind as she slept. Fogged mirrors, darkened hallways, and the unsettling sensation of being watched. At first, she thought they were nothing more than her overactive imagination working overtime, feeding on the stress of the move, the loneliness, and the house's peculiar atmosphere. But after a week, the dreams became more vivid, more tangible, until they weren't just nightmares anymore. They were something worse. A warning. Every night, the same scene unfolded. She stood in the bathroom, staring at herself in the cracked mirror. But something was wrong with her reflection. Her face seemed warped, almost unrecognizable, like it had been pulled and twisted by unseen hands. The skin sagged unnaturally. Her eyes were sunken, her lips too thin and stretched tight across her teeth. The reflection didn't just look different, it felt different, like it was no longer hers. In these dreams, she wasn't alone. Though she couldn't see it, Sara could feel a presence behind her, something lurking just outside the bathroom door. The air was thick with the stench of damp rot, and behind her the tub was always full, the surface of the water dark and still. She never turned around to see what was waiting in the shadows, but she knew it was there. Someone watching her. The dreams didn't stop there. They evolved, grew more detailed, more horrifying. One night, she found herself in the tub, fully submerged in freezing cold water. Her lungs burned as she tried to scream, but no sound came out. She clawed at the porcelain, trying to pull herself free, but something held her down, invisible hands pressing on her chest, pushing her deeper. The tub filled her world, dark and infinite, and the only thing she could hear was the slow, steady drip, drip, drip of water. When she woke, she would be drenched in sweat, her breathing heavy and labored. But there was something else. Every time she pulled the covers back, her skin was wet. Actually wet, as though she had truly been in that tub for hours. Her hands were wrinkled, the skin pruned from the moisture. She couldn't explain it. The nightmares were seeping into her waking life, merging the lines between dream and reality in ways she couldn't escape. The worst part was that every time she opened her eyes in the middle of the night, her gaze would immediately be drawn to the bathroom door. No matter what, it was always open. Just a crack, wide enough for something to watch her from the darkness beyond. She swore she closed it every night before bed, yet in the morning it was ajar again. The small sliver of space made her heart race with dread. She couldn't see into the bathroom, but she could feel the cold air seeping out, reaching for her like icy fingers. The following night, the nightmare returned, but it was worse than before. This time, it wasn't just her reflection in the mirror that was distorted. The room itself seemed to be warping, the walls bending inward, closing in on her. The tiles were cracked, oozing something dark and sticky, and the ceiling dripped with condensation that felt more like blood than water. In this dream, the whispers began. They were soft at first, barely audible, like someone speaking through a wall. She strained to hear, but as the voices grew louder, their message became clear. They weren't just random words, they were pleading, desperate. You're not alone. It's coming. You can't leave. Each phrase wrapped around her mind, tightening like a noose, choking her with fear. She would wake up, gasping for breath, her hands trembling as she flicked on the light beside her bed. But even then, the whispers wouldn't fade. They lingered, like echoes bouncing off the walls of her consciousness, making it impossible for her to shake the feeling that she was, in fact, not alone. The feeling of being watched became constant. It wasn't just in her dreams anymore. It followed her into the day, creeping into her waking hours. She'd catch herself glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking behind her. When she went into the bathroom to splash water on her face, she could feel the weight of the mirror's gaze pressing down on her. Sometimes she was too scared to look up, terrified of what she might see staring back at her. After 2 weeks of restless sleep, the dreams escalated. One night, the sound of the dripping water became deafening. It reverberated through the walls of the house, a constant reminder of something unseen. In her dream, she found herself standing over the tub, watching it slowly fill with murky water. But this time, there was something beneath the surface. A shape, a figure, faint and distorted, but unmistakably human, lay submerged beneath the dark water. Sara stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The water rippled, and slowly a hand emerged from the tub. Pale, bloated, the fingers wrinkled and waterlogged, reaching out for her. She was frozen in place, unable to move as the hand crept closer, inch by inch. "Help me," a voice whispered from the tub, barely audible but chilling. The hand extended further, its fingertips brushing against her leg, leaving a trail of freezing water in its wake. She screamed, jolting awake in her bed, her body covered in a cold sweat. Her skin was damp, and when she looked down, her leg had a wet smear running down it, just where the hand had touched her in the dream. She gasped, stumbling out of bed, backing into the far corner of her room, too terrified to breathe. The bathroom door was wide open this time, the darkness within almost impenetrable, like it was a void waiting to consume her. She could no longer deny it. The nightmares weren't just figments of her imagination. Something was happening in that bathroom, something that wanted her attention. The more she ignored it, the more aggressive it became. It was trying to reach her, pulling her deeper into its world, night after night. Sara spent the next day in a haze, sleep-deprived and on edge. She couldn't think clearly, her mind clouded by exhaustion and fear. Every creak of the house made her jump, every shadow seemed to hold some lurking presence. She found herself avoiding the bathroom, closing the door every time she passed it, as though that simple act could keep whatever haunted it at bay. But she knew the truth. The house, the bathroom, the nightmares, they were all connected. It wasn't just her mind playing tricks on her. Something else lived within these walls, and it wasn't going to stop until it had her. The nightmares were only the beginning, and Sara wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. Sara's nerves were frayed, her thoughts muddled by exhaustion. The house had stripped her of sleep, peace, and now even the illusion of safety. She could no longer tell where the nightmares ended and reality began. Every corner of the old house seemed to whisper to her, as if it had been waiting for someone to hear its secrets. And now, it seemed, the house had chosen her. The voices began softly at first, barely there, nothing more than a low hum that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. She could almost dismiss it as the groaning of old wood, the shifting of a house far past its prime. But as the days passed, the sounds became more insistent, more human. The whispers, once faint, were now growing louder, more distinct. They followed her from room to room, always just beyond hearing but unmistakably present. The worst of it, though, was in the bathroom. It had started with the scratching. One night, as Sara brushed her teeth, she heard it, a soft, rhythmic scraping coming from somewhere behind the walls. She froze, her toothbrush suspended mid-air, her ears straining to catch the sound again. There it was, faint but unmistakable. Something was moving behind the tiles, clawing its way toward her. She tried to tell herself it was just an animal, a rat or some other creature, trapped in the walls, but the sound was too deliberate, too desperate. After that night, the scratching grew worse, more frequent. Every time she entered the bathroom, it was there, a maddening, frantic sound that seemed to intensify the longer she stayed in the room. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to escape from the walls. It gnawed at her sanity, the constant scrape, a reminder that she was never truly alone. Then came the voices. At first, they were just murmurs, indistinct and muffled, like the sound of a distant conversation. She could hear them through the walls, especially at night when the house was at its quietest. She would lie in bed, the blankets pulled tight around her, and listen to the faint, disjointed whispers that seemed to seep from the very structure of the house. The words were garbled, half-formed, as if they were being spoken through layers of earth or water. Sometimes they sounded like pleading, other times like weeping. But no matter how hard she strained to understand them, She could never quite make out what they were saying. It wasn't long before the voices began to take shape, becoming clearer, more distinct. They were no longer confined to the bathroom. Now they followed her everywhere. She heard them in the kitchen, in the living room, even when she sat on the porch, trying to escape the oppressive atmosphere inside. The voices seemed to surround her, pressing in from all sides, their whispers filling her mind with an unbearable tension. One afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table, trying to eat a meal she had no appetite for, she heard it again. A voice, clear this time, coming from just behind the walls. "Help me." The fork clattered to her plate, her heart skipping a beat. She stood up slowly, her hands trembling, and walked toward the wall. She pressed her ear against the cold plaster, her breath shallow. For a moment there was nothing but silence, and she wondered if she had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. A woman's voice, faint but unmistakable. "Please help me." Sara staggered back, her pulse racing. She could feel her heart pounding in her throat, her skin prickling with fear. There was no denying it now. Someone or something was trapped inside the walls. Determined to understand what was happening, Sara called the landlord, Mr. Delaney. He was evasive from the start, his voice tight and impatient, as if he had expected her call but wanted to avoid it. When she mentioned the sounds coming from the walls, the voices, his tone changed. He became defensive, dismissive, telling her it was nothing more than the settling of the house, that old homes had a way of making noise. But she could hear the tremor in his voice, the way his words quickened. He was lying. "Mr. Delaney," she pressed, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "What aren't you telling me? What happened in this house?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Some things are better left alone, Sara." She demanded answers, but he hung up before she could get another word in. His refusal to speak only deepened her terror. Whatever was happening here, he knew about it, and he had chosen not to warn her. That night, Sara couldn't sleep. The house was too loud, the walls practically vibrating with the sound of whispers. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to block out the noise, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just murmurs now, they were pleading. Desperate voices crying out from the darkness, begging for her to help them. Unable to stand it any longer, Sara got out of bed and made her way to the bathroom, the source of all the house's horrors. Her fingers shook as she gripped the door handle, slowly pushing it open. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and the familiar stench of damp rot hit her immediately. The mirror above the sink was fogged over, as if someone had just taken a hot shower. But Sara hadn't used the bathroom in hours. She wiped a shaky hand across the glass, clearing a small circle, and stared at her reflection. She barely recognized herself anymore, her skin pale, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep. But as she stood there, something caught her eye. At the bottom of the mirror, barely noticeable, was a small latch. It was old, rusted, and covered in grime, but it was unmistakably a latch, hidden in plain sight. Her heart raced as she reached out, her fingers trembling, and pulled at it. With a soft creak, the section of the wall behind the sink slid open, revealing a narrow, dark crawl space. The air that rushed out was thick and sour, a mix of mold and something metallic, like old blood. Sara gagged, covering her mouth as she shone her phone's flashlight inside. The beam of light revealed deep, jagged scratches on the walls, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. The sight made her stomach turn. But worse than the scratches were the markings, symbols carved into the wood, crude and desperate, like the work of someone unhinged. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was looking at. The voices in the walls weren't just in her head. Someone had been trapped in this space. Someone had lived and died in the walls of this house. As Sara stared deeper into the crawl space, her light caught something else. A pair of eyes. Pale, glassy eyes staring back at her from the darkness. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if it were right next to her ear. "Help me," Sara screamed, slamming the panel shut, her heart racing as she stumbled back. She could still hear the scratching, the desperate sound of nails against wood, and the whispers. They were no longer distant. They were all around her now, pressing against her mind, suffocating her with their pleas. The house was alive, and it was filled with the voices of the dead. There was no escape from the truth now. Sara wasn't imagining the voices, the whispers, or the scratching. The house was haunted by something far darker than she could have ever anticipated, and whatever lived inside the walls wasn't going to let her go without a fight. The voices had found her, and now they wanted her to join them. Sara's breaths came in shallow gasps as she stared at the bathroom mirror. Her reflection seemed wrong, distorted, not in the way it had been in the nightmares, but worse. This time it was as if the mirror had absorbed something from the house, a malevolence that had taken root deep within the glass. She didn't recognize the person staring back at her. Her eyes were wide, hollow, and shadowed, her skin pale and gaunt, as if something had drained the life from her over these past few weeks. The whispers were louder now, surrounding her like a swarm, their cold words pressing against her skull. She could feel them inside her head, crawling beneath her skin, relentless in their need to be heard. "Help me. Don't leave me. It's coming for you." She couldn't ignore them anymore. Whatever was lurking in the walls, whatever had taken hold of this house, had been waiting for her. It had fed off her fear, her loneliness, and now it was ready to reveal itself. With trembling hands, Sara backed away from the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. She had tried to leave the house earlier that night. She'd packed a bag, grabbed her keys, and rushed to the door. But no matter how hard she pulled, it wouldn't open. The locks had jammed, the windows were sealed shut, and the walls seemed to pulse, closing in around her like a trap. The house had become her prison, and now it was playing its final hand. The bathroom door creaked behind her, slowly swinging open with a sound that made her stomach turn. A cold gust of air brushed against her neck, sending shivers racing down her spine. She wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped. "It's in the mirror," she thought, her eyes darting back to the warped glass. The mirror had always been the source of the house's darkness, the portal through which the horrors bled into her reality. She had avoided it for days, terrified of what might be lurking on the other side, but she could no longer run from the truth. This was where it would end. Sara stepped closer to the mirror, her legs trembling beneath her. The whispers had quieted, but she could still feel their presence, their cold breath against her ear. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to look. Slowly, she reached out, her fingertips brushing against the surface of the glass. It felt colder than ice, and for a moment she thought she saw her reflection blink. An unnatural movement, too fast to belong to her. Her heart raced. Something was inside the mirror, trapped between the glass and the reality she knew. It had been watching her this whole time, waiting for her to come close enough. A ripple spread across the surface, distorting her reflection into a twisted, grotesque version of herself. Her eyes widened in horror as the image in the mirror grinned, not her grin, but something else entirely. The lips stretched too far, the teeth too sharp, the skin too pale. It was it. The thing that had been haunting her nightmares, whispering to her through the walls. The reflection began to move, independent of her, stepping closer to the surface as if the glass no longer separated them. Sara stumbled back, her pulse racing, her body frozen in terror. The reflection reached out, its fingers pressing against the inside of the mirror, and Sara could feel the cold touch on her skin as if the glass between them was dissolving. The voice in the mirror spoke, low and guttural, its words dripping with malice. "You can't leave, Sara. You belong to us now." She screamed, scrambling backward as the reflection's hand pushed through the glass, its fingers curling around the edge of the frame. The mirror rippled like water, the surface bending and warping as the figure began to crawl through, its body distorted and bloated, like something that had been rotting in a grave. The stench of decay filled the room, choking her, making her gag. Desperate, Sara turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the small, suffocating space. She pounded against the wood, her fists bruising as she tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The house wouldn't let her go. The reflection was fully through the mirror now, its body towering over her, grotesque and twisted. It wasn't her anymore. It was something else, something ancient and evil. Its hollow eyes bore into hers, and she could feel its hunger, its need to consume her, to pull her into the darkness where countless others had already been lost. "You've been chosen," it hissed, its voice scraping against her mind like broken glass. "This house needs a soul, and now it has yours." Sara's body trembled with terror, her legs buckling beneath her as she fell to the floor. The thing reached down, its cold fingers brushing against her skin, and she felt the life drain from her, the warmth seeping out of her body as the house claimed what it had been waiting for. In a final moment of clarity, she realized the truth. The house had never been empty. It had always been filled with the souls of those who had come before her, those who had been lured here by the same malevolent force. They were still here, trapped behind the walls, their whispers crying out for help, but no one had ever escaped. No one had ever left. She had been doomed from the moment she stepped through the door. The reflection knelt beside her, its eyes dark and endless, and Sara felt herself slipping away, her consciousness fading as the house consumed her. The last thing she saw was the mirror, her reflection, smiling back at her. It was no longer distorted, no longer twisted. It looked exactly like her, but she knew it wasn't. It was them. With her final breath, Sara understood what the house had been trying to show her all along. The mirror wasn't just a reflection of her. It was a doorway, a portal through which the souls of the dead reached out, pulling the living into their world. And now it had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others before her. The house stood silent once again, its whispers quiet, satisfied. The mirror gleamed softly in the dim light, reflecting nothing but the empty room. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the house was waiting for the next soul to arrive,